Hello everyone, my name is Max and I'm joined today by my two partners Andrew and Lucas. This is our project on weapon development during World War II. In this portion of the video, we will talk about a few people who both impacted and were impacted by the construction of the atomic bomb, although not as well known as the famous nuclear scientists of the Manhattan Project. Lydia Martinez worked various jobs at Los Alamos, home of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, during and after the Manhattan Project. She lived in the neighboring community of El Rancho. She first worked as a babysitter and housekeeper for families such as the Fermis, Tellers, and Critchfields, all famous scientists who worked on the atomic bomb. She was also a junior technician in the X7 group, where she measured the diameter of wires that would later be placed in detonators. At one point, she was put in charge of moving around 200 offices, and she received the laboratory's Distinguished Performance Award for getting all the equipment up and running before the scientists moved in. After the war, she remained at Los Alamos National Laboratory, working in various units and finally retiring as Property Administrative Specialist. Isabel Torres, from the neighboring community of Santa Cruz, New Mexico, also worked at Los Alamos during and after the Manhattan Project. She commuted to Los Alamos first by truck, then by bus. She worked in the administration office as a classified mail messenger, where she reports having made just $100 a month picking up the mail for the U.S. engineers from the local post office, and then sorting it out and putting it into the cubbyholes. Torres remembers how her job granted her access to different areas of the laboratory, and she mentions interactions with soldiers and prominent scientists, including Edward Teller. Similar to Torres and Martinez, Esther Vigil was living in nearby Española Valley with her family when Los Alamos was selected as a site for the Manhattan Project. She attended school at Los Alamos for several years, where soldiers from the nearby laboratory would come by and teach the class. Both she and her mother worked at Los Alamos, babysitting for famous scientists like Edward Teller and Stanislaus Ulam. Vigil also worked for the Supply and Property Department at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where she handled ordering and storing supplies. All three of these women worked in or around the Manhattan Project in minor yet significant ways. However, all of them can attest to the secrecy of the project itself. Martinez and Torres, who were both working their respective jobs during the atomic bomb's construction, had absolutely no idea what was being built. In fact, they both mentioned in their interviews that they and their fellow employees were happy enough to have jobs and decided to focus on that instead. To quote Martinez's interview, "While you worked in the technical division, did you have any idea what the work was all about? The end result, did you know anything about?"
We had no idea. I know when I was living with the Gordons, Dr. Fermi came over to their house to borrow their alarm clock, and that's probably when they had that test at Trinity sites over at the Alamogordo.
Were people curious about?
Nobody was curious.
Nobody was curious?
We weren't curious at all.
People...
We just were glad to have jobs up there, so no.
While Vigil was too young to work before the dropping of the first bomb, she recounts military soldiers coming over to teach classes on English and even the makeup of atoms in general nuclear chemistry, along with how to make them explode, while she was only in 5th or 6th grade. This material was, of course, well over her and her fellow classmates' heads, but one can understand the fear factor that stems from the talk of huge nuclear weapons being made right next door.
Now to look at the weapon development in the country of Japan. The infamous Unit 731, led by Lieutenant General Hiroshito, comprised of 3,000 Japanese researchers working at Unit 731's headquarters in Harbin, China, experimented on humans for weapons to be used in biological warfare. They would perform live vivisections to examine their patients. The vivisections were when doctors would cut open their live humans and start experimenting on their organs. Some patients would try to fight back, but they would soon stop because they knew their fate. Doctors would be traumatized when working on vivisections, as one of the doctors of Unit 731 explains about one girl he operated on. "The little girl appears in my dreams. I cannot forget the vivisections ever." Unit 731 caused panic in Harbin, China, by taking prisoners from the local jail as well as local citizens that were captured by the secret police. They would catch people surreptitiously and bring them to their laboratory in Harbin. Harbin native Lang Yu said, local residents were afraid every day that they might be kidnapped by the Chinese. Before going outside, I had to stop and think, are the Chinese around? Unit 731 used secret police to go out and get more logs whenever they were running out of people in the nearby prison. The logs is a term for doctors of Unit 743 as a way to describe their patients. Since Harbin was so close to China and Russia, the Unit 731 fronted their headquarters as a lumber factory to avoid any questioning from the Chinese and the Russians. Fang Zhenghu, a slave laborer at the time, saw a boxcar with arms sticking out and blood dripping out. It passed by him going to a factory. He asked one of the guards what was in the car, and one of them laughed, saying logs. But, quote, he knew there weren't logs in there. Unit 731 doctors performed tests on their prisoners with bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, and other various deadly diseases. This would lead to research and the development of the defolication bacilli bomb and the flea bomb, used to spread the bubonic plague into the neighboring towns around Harbin. These bombs enabled Japanese soldiers to launch biological attacks by affecting agriculture, reservoirs, wells, and other areas with anthrax and plague-carrying fleas. They would also infect the food supplies in China not occupied by Japanese forces. During these biological bomb experiments, doctors dressed in protective suits would go out and examine their victims. When the plague suddenly broke out in our town, it killed a lot of people. Then, these doctors with white masks and suits started appearing in our town. They pulled people into two groups and then pulled one of them into the field and started cutting them open while they were still alive. Local inhabitant Wang Zhang recalls, the experiments were not always on the civilians of Harbin and its surrounding cities. United States POWs recalled being visited by doctors who injected them with shots, and they were told they were just for their health. 3 months passed, and the doctors returned to soldiers. Some of them were doing poorly and nearly died. United States POW Arthur Campbell believes that, quote, they gave me anthrax and scarlet fever. Though there were plans to use biological weapons in World War II, they were never executed because of the ending of the war. But when the war was ending, the unit destroyed all their headquarters, but keeping their research. General Ishishita cleverly realized that the research conducted could be their get-out-of-jail ticket when they got put on trial. His plan worked. When they got put on trial in Tokyo and Kharkov, Ishishita gave his plans to the United States and Russia. In return, him and his doctors were freed. Most of the Unit 731 war criminals went on to respectable careers in Japan's medical field, while some of the unlucky doctors received terms of 20 to 25 years. After the trial, doctors were asked why they would do such things to human beings, and they all responded with the same thing. Quote, I was given an order. Unit 731 was the worst thing Japan was responsible for during World War II. And Katsuhiko Yamato, executive secretary of the Tokyo-based Society to support the demands of Chinese war victims, apologized and called for support of the victims, saying, we as Japanese citizens support those who suffer from what Japan did during the war, just as we sincerely accept the fact that the Japanese army invaded China. By supporting the victims, I hope we understand the importance of peace, and Japan must recognize our act of aggression. Again, Asian countries should assume the responsibility of paying compensation to their victims. As years passed on, some doctors later apologized for their action, and they offer support for remembering this because, quote, it is a good reminder of what happened and must never happen again.
Alex Willerstein is an assistant professor of science and technology studies at the Stevenson's Institute of Technology and specializes in the history of nuclear weapons and nuclear secrecy. Wellerstein describes the difference between the uranium little boy bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and the plutonium fat man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. There are two fissile materials used in nuclear weapons: uranium, otherwise known as U-235, and plutonium, otherwise known as Pu-239. Unlike uranium, plutonium is a man-made substance. It's an element that, generally speaking, does not exist in nature. A uranium bomb uses a gun-type assembly, which means that you blow up a small explosive, which sends a small chunk of uranium onto another chunk of uranium, which reaches the critical mass and explodes. A plutonium bomb cannot be built in this way, because plutonium is not as dense as uranium, so they crush the plutonium by surrounding it with C4 and blowing it up at the same time, which automatically explodes. Plutonium is all around more dangerous to build atomic weapons with, but also produces a greater weapon. For reference, plutonium is a radioactive chemical element. When exposed to moist air, it forms oxides and hydrides that expand the sample up to 70% in volume, which in turn flake off as a powder and catches fire when exposed to oxygen. With its radioactive qualities and potentially destructive force, plutonium is the sole ingredient of the atomic bomb. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was an American theoretical physicist and professor of physics at the University of California, Berkeley. Oppenheimer was the wartime head of the Los Alamos Laboratory and is among those who are credited with being the father of the atomic bomb for their role in the Manhattan Project, the World War II undertaking that developed the first nuclear weapons used in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One of the biggest challenges his scientists faced was the development of a sound method of implosion, actually constructing a bomb which could hold these chemicals and ignite it at their will, and purifying plutonium. Oppenheimer declared this as the most difficult aspect of the project, calling it an unavailing effort to purify plutonium. A whole division of his laboratory worked on that and found it was not relevant or usable, eventually giving up and working on other things. William Howe worked in the Special Engineering Detachment and arrived in Los Alamos and began assisting physicist Arthur Wall, who was actually the one who physically found plutonium during his studies at the University of California, Berkeley. William Howe recalls working with Wall on the process of purifying the plutonium for the atomic bomb which hit Nagasaki, which was later called the Fat Man bomb. This process was dangerous, and a certain laboratory in the United States exploded because they did not take the right precautions. Howe and Wall developed what they called the Wall-Howe device, which was a complicated set of condenser valves, pots, hoses, and machinery to move liquids around. They had to take serious precaution, keeping their materials in a bunker with heavy concrete walls and dirt over it, so that if it blew up, it would not blow up the building they were working in. Exposure to radiation was also a problem. They had to avoid putting together enough plutonium so that it would go critical, because it would be an issue, a burst of radiation that would kill people, which unfortunately killed Cyril Kelly, which worked for Howe. In 1941, after much trial and error, William Howe and Arthur Wall went on to produce the plutonium for the Trinity test in Los Alamos, which was the site of the first successful detonated atomic bomb. The Trinity test was a milestone for those working on the Manhattan Project, and it would lead to the eventual dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan during World War II.